All right. Good evening, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well. Tonight we are going to read through chapter 40 of David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. Oh, there's something wrong here. I don't know why it's blurry. I think we have to change. There we go. That's much better. All right. If this is your first time watching, we're not just reading through the chapter. We're stopping and we're talking about interesting vocabulary words. Vocabulary words where if you're learning English, if you're a pretty advanced learner of English, maybe you don't know these words and maybe you will find them useful, or possibly phrases or expressions that you might find useful. So if you're watching this live, because I'm doing this live right now, then I encourage you to ask questions in the comments. What does this mean? What does that mean? And I will be happy to answer your questions. And I encourage that, actually. If you don't ask questions, then I will just stop sometimes and explain certain words that maybe I think you would find useful or interesting, or phrases that I think you don't understand. So definitely ask questions as we go. Let's see. I had to switch my... I don't know what to call it, but I have to change the music, my mood music. Okay, there we go. That's probably better. All right, so this is chapter 40 of David Copperfield by Charles Dickens, The Wanderer. You know, wandering is just walking around with no purpose, no destination, no special reason. So if you're a wanderer, that's a person usually who goes from place to place, who doesn't have a home and doesn't have any purpose. So let's find out about the wanderer. We had a very serious conversation in Buckingham Street that night about the domestic occurrences I have detailed in the last chapter. My aunt was deeply interested in them and walked up and down the room with her arms folded. For more than 2 hours afterwards, whenever she was particularly discomposed, we've seen the word composure before, or to be composed, and that means to not show your emotions. So if you're feeling sad or angry, you keep like a poker face. You don't show anything. To be discomposed means to show your emotions, show what you're thinking. His aunt never really shows well, she does actually. Sometimes she gets really angry at people. But so whenever his aunt was showing a lot of emotion is what that means. Whenever she was particularly discomposed, she always performed one of these pedestrian feats. Pedestrian means walking, using your feet. And pedestrian feat means a thing that she does with walking, which I think he means just walking this way and that way in the apartment. And the amount of her discomposure might always be estimated by the duration of her walk. So the more upset she was, the longer the duration was longer of her little walk back and forth, pacing back and forth in the apartment. On this occasion, she was so much disturbed in the mind as to find it necessary to open the bedroom door and make a course for herself, comprising the full extent of the bedroom from wall to wall. And while Mr. Dick and I sat quietly by the fire, she kept passing in and out along this measured track at an unchanging pace, with the regularity of a clock pendulum. You know, a clock has anything that swings like this, or not anything, but most things that swing like this is it's called a pendulum. So a clock pendulum is that part of a clock that goes like this. So that's what she was doing. She was walking in one room and out the other room, walking in one room and out the other room in a very systematic way, in a very regular way, like a pendulum. When my aunt and I were left to ourselves by Mr. Dix going out to bed, I sat down to write my letter to the two old ladies. By that time she was tired of walking, and sat by the fire with her dress tucked up as usual, but instead of sitting in her usual manner, holding her glass upon her knee, she suffered it to stand neglected on the chimney-piece, and resting her left elbow on her right arm, and her chin in her left hand, looked thoughtfully at me. As often as I raised my eyes from what I was about, I met hers. "I am in the lovingest of tempers, my dear," she would assure me with a nod, "but I am fidgeted and sorry." Fidgeting is moving, making weird little movements with your body. So, sometimes people are always touching themselves or moving their arms or legs. That's fidgeting. You say, stop fidgeting. I had been too busy to observe until after she was gone to bed that she had left her night mixture, as she always called it, untasted on the chimney-piece. She came to her door with even more than her usual affection of manner when I knocked to acquaint her with this discovery, but only said, "I have not the heart to take it, Trot, tonight," and shook her head and went in again. She read my letter to the two old ladies in the morning and approved of it. I posted it, and had nothing to do then but wait as patiently as I could for a reply. I was still in the state of expectation, and had been for nearly a week, when I left the doctor's one snowy night to walk home. It had been a bitter day, and a cutting northeast wind had blown for some time. The wind had gone down with the light, and so the snow had come on. It was heavy, settled fall. It was a heavy, settled fall, I recollect, in great flakes, and it lay thick. The noise of wheels and the tread of people were as hushed as if the streets had been strewn in that depth with feathers. My shortest way home, and I naturally took the shortest way on such a night, was through St. Martin's Lane. Now the church, which gave its name to the lane, stood in a less free situation at that time, there being no open space before it, and the lane winding down to the Strand. As I passed the steps of the portico, I encountered at the corner a woman's face. It looked in mine, passed across the narrow lane, and disappeared. I knew it. I'd seen it somewhere, but I could not remember where. I had some association with it that struck upon my heart directly, but I was thinking of anything else when it came upon me, and was confused. On the steps of the church, there was the stooping figure of a man who had put down some burden on the smooth snow to adjust it. A burden is something heavy that you carry. So this man was carrying something heavy in the cold and the snow, and he put it down to rest. Oh, to adjust it. My seeing the face and my seeing him were simultaneous. I don't think I had stopped in my surprise, but in any case, as I went on, he rose, turned, and came down towards me. I stood face to face with Mr. Peggotty. Then I remembered the woman. It was Martha, to whom Emily had given the money that night in the kitchen. Martha Endell. Side by side with whom? He would not have seen his dear niece. With whom he would not have seen his dear niece, Ham had told me, for all the treasures wrecked in the sea. Very early, well, not very early, but in the middle somewhere of this story, a very strange thing happened where a mysterious girl came to see, what is her name? Emily. And this girl was in a lot of trouble. Nobody really said what it was, but I think we could imagine that she was pregnant but wasn't married, and that was her trouble. And Emily gave all of her money and all of Ham's money to this girl so that she could run away to London. That was maybe, I guess that could have been like maybe 2 years ago or something like that. 2 years ago in this story. And so she left the town, Yarmouth, in shame and went to London with the money to help her start a new life. And now Mr. Peggotty, who's looking for Emily, his niece, who ran away with a boy, he just saw them. They were having a meeting. Mr. Peggotty and this girl Emily just had a meeting, which is kind of interesting. Martha, this girl Martha, sorry. Master Davy, he said, gripping me tight, it do my heart good to see you, sir. Well met, well met. Well met, my dear old friend, said I. I had my thoughts a coming to make inquiration for you, sir, tonight, he said, but knowing as your aunt was living along with you, for I've been down yonder, Yarmouth way, I feared it was too late. I should have come early in the morning, sir, afore going away. Again? Said I. Yes, sir, he replied patiently, shaking his head. I'm away tomorrow. Where are you going now? I asked. Well, he replied, shaking the snow out of his long hair, I was a-going to turn in somewheres. To turn in means to go to bed, to find a place to sleep, to go to bed. So if you're going to bed, oh, I'm so tired, you can say, well, I'm turning in. That means I'm going to bed. In those days, there was a side entrance to the stable yard of the Golden Cross, the inn so memorable to me, in connection with his misfortune, nearly opposite to where we stood. I pointed out the gateway, put my arm through his, and we went across. 2 or 3 public rooms opened out of the stable yard, and looking into one of them, and finding it empty and a good fire burning, I took him there. When I saw him in the light, I observed not only that his hair was long and ragged, so his hair was very messy, but that his face was burnt dark by the sun. He was grayer. The lines in his face and forehead were deeper, and he had every appearance of having toiled and wandered through all varieties of weather. But he looked very strong, and like a man upheld by steadfastness of purpose whom nothing could tire out, he shook the snow from his hat and clothes, and brushed it away from his face. While I was inwardly making these remarks, as he sat down opposite me at the table, with his back to the door by which he had entered, he put out his rough hand again and grasped mine warmly. I'll tell you, Master Davy, he said, where all I been and what all we've heard, I've been for, and we've heard little, but I'll tell you. I rang the bell for something hot to drink. He would have nothing stronger than ale. And while it was being brought and being warmed at the fire, he sat thinking. There was a fine, massive gravity in his face I did not venture to disturb. When she was a child, he said, lifting up his head soon after we were left alone, she used to talk to me a deal about the sea, about them coasts where the sea got to be dark blue, and to lay a-shining in the sun. I thought odd times, as her father being drownded, made her think on it so much. I don't know, you see, but maybe she believed or hoped she had drifted out to them parts where the flowers is always a-blowin' and the country bright. So she was dreaming of a warm tropical place where it's always warm. It is likely to have been a childish fancy, I replied. When she was lost, said Mr. Peggotty, I know in my mind as she would take her to them countries, as he would take her to them countries. I knowed in my mind as he'd have told her wonders of 'em, and how she was to be a lady there, and how he got her to listen to him first. I don't know what he's saying here. Along or such like. When we see his mother, I knowed quite well as I was right. I went across Channel to France, and landed there, and if I'd fell down as if I'd fell down from the sky. I found out an English gentleman was in authority, said Mr. Peggotty, and told him I was going to seek my niece. He got me them papers as I wanted for to carry me through. I don't rightly know how they're called. So he got traveling. He took a boat to France, and then he found I don't know, some kind of official government office or something from England, and he got some papers or permission to go around France. I think that's what I understand, but I'm not sure. And he would give me money, but I was thankful to have no need on. I thanked him kind for all he done, I'm sure. I wrote afore you, he says to me, I shall speak to many as will come that way, and many will know you. For distant from here, when you're traveling alone, I told him, I don't understand what he's talking about. I guess it's not a government office. It's just some generous Englishman that he met, I guess, when he landed in France, who helped arrange papers for him to travel easily, and even offered him money when he heard the whole story of how he's looking for his niece. That seems to be what it sounds like. When you're a-travelin' alone, I told him, best as I was able, what my gratitude was, and went away through France. Alone? On foot? Said I. Mostly afoot, he rejoined. Sometimes in carts along with people going to market, sometimes in empty coaches, many mile a day afoot, and often with some poor soldier or another, travelling to see his friends. I couldn't talk to him, said Mr. Peggotty, nor he to me, but we was company for one another, too, alongside the dusty roads. When I came to any town, he pursued, I found the inn, and waited about the yard, till someone turned up, someone mostly did, and knowed English. Then I told that I was on my way to seek my niece, and they told me what manner of gentlefolks was in the house, and I waited to see any as seemed like her, going in or out. When it weren't Emily, I went on again, by a little and little. So he's going to all these little villages in France, waiting around inns, which are small hotels, very, very small hotels. And then he would try to find someone who spoke English to ask if there were any strangers or any English people staying in the town. And if there were, he would stay and wait to find them to see if it was his niece, Emily. When I come to a new village or that, among the poor people, I found they knowed about me. They would set me down at their cottage doors, and give me what not for to eat and drink, and show me where to sleep. And many a woman, Master Davy, as had a daughter of about Emily's age, I found a waitin' for me at our Saviour's cross outside the village, for to do me similar kindness. So people started talking about this strange Englishman going from village to village, looking for his niece who was in big trouble. And they felt sorry for him because they have daughters his age and they would never want that to happen. So they began to start preparing for him as he entered the villages, and they would feed him and find him a place to stay and take care of him as he was going from village to village, because they understood what he was doing. Some has had daughters as was dead, and God only knows how good them mothers was to me. So the mothers who had dead daughters were especially kind to him. It was Martha at the door. I saw her haggard, listening face distinctly. My dread was... Well, I'm a little bit confused. Wait, let's see. My dread was lest he should turn his head to see her. Oh, okay. So this girl who was in trouble, Martha, passed Davy like she was going away from Mr. Peggotty, like they had met. So they met in the snow for some transaction, who knows what. And then Martha goes away. She passes Davy as she's going away. And now they're sitting at this pub by a fire, and Davy can see Martha at the door. So she's come back. It was Martha at the door. I saw her haggard. Haggard look means like distressed, tired looking. So her haggard, listening face distinctly. So she's actually listening to the story from where she is. But Mr. Peggotty doesn't know that she's there. My dread was lest he should turn his head and see her too. And Davy didn't want Mr. Peggotty to know that she was there listening. They would often put their children, particular their little girls, said Mr. Peggotty, upon my knee, and many a time you might have seen me sitting at their doors when night was coming in, almost as if they had been my darling's children. Oh, my darling. Overpowered by sudden grief, he sobbed aloud. Sobbing is really loud crying. I laid my trembling hand... Where's the camera? I laid my trembling hand upon the hand he put before his face. Thank you, sir, he said. Don't take no notice. That just means, just pretend I'm not crying. In a very little while, he took his hand away and put it on his breast. This is your breast here, this area. And went on with his story. They often walked with me, he said, in the morning, maybe a mile or two upon my road, and when we parted, and I said, I'm very thankful to you, God bless you, they always seemed to understand and answered pleasant. At last I came to the sea. It weren't hard, you may suppose, for a seafaring man like me to work his way over to Italy. When I got there, I wandered on as I had done afore. The people were just as good to me, and I should have gone from town to town, maybe the country through, but that I got news of her being seen among them Swiss mountains yonder. Yonder, that's an old word. People don't really use it too much anymore, but it means over there. One is knowed his servants seen 'em, all three, and told me how they travelled and where they was. I made for them mountains, Master Davy, day and night, ever so fur as I went. Ever so fur the mountains seemed to shift away from me. So you ever do that, like you're going close to something big, like a lot of mountains in the distance, And the more you walk, the closer you get to them. It seems like they're moving away from you as you're walking. But I come up with them, and I crossed them. And when I got high, the place as I had been told of, I began to think with my own self, what shall I do when I see her? The listening face, insensible to the inclement night, still drooped at the door, and the hands begged me, prayed me not to cast it forth. I never doubted her, said Mr. Peggotty. No, not a bit. Only let her see my face. Only let her bear my voice. Only let my standing still afore her bring her thoughts, the home she had fled away from, and the child she had been. And if she had growed to be a royal lady, she'd have fell down at my feet. I knowed it well. Many a time in my sleep had I heard her cry out, Uncle, and seen her fall like death afore me. Many a time in my sleep I had raised her up and whispered to her, Emily, my dear, I'm come for to bring forgiveness and take you home. So Mr. Peggotty is thinking, wow, what if I find her? What am I going to say? And he decides, if I find her, I'm not going to say anything. I'm just going to come to her and stand in front of her and let her see my face. And that should be enough. That will remind her of home and where she's supposed to be. And she'll come home with me. I don't have to say anything. She can just see me and she'll come home. He stopped and shook his head and went on with a sigh. He was naught to me now, Emily was all. I bought a country dress to put upon her, and I knowed that, once found, she would walk beside me over them stony roads, go where I would, and never, never leave me a more. To put that dress upon her, to cast off what she wore, to take her on my arm again, and wander towards home, to stop sometimes upon the road, to heal her bruised feet and her worse bruised heart, was all that I thought of now. I don't believe I should have done so much as look at him, but Master Davy, it warn't to be, not yet. I was too late. They was gone. Where? I couldn't learn. Some said beer, some said there. I travelled beer, and I travelled there. But I found no Emily, and I travelled home. How long ago? I asked. A matter of 4 days, said Mr. Peggotty. So that was just 4 days ago, I guess, that he arrived home. I sighted the old boat arter dark, and the light shining in the winder. When I said, come nigh, and looked in through the glass, I see the faithful creature, Mrs. Gummidge, sitting by the fire. So 4 days ago he arrived home to his house, and he looked in the window, and he can even just see Mrs. Gummidge sitting there by the fire. As we had fixed upon alone, I called out, don't be afeard, it's Dan'l, and I went in. I never could have thought how the old boat would have been so strange. From some pocket in his breast, he took out, with a very careful hand, a small paper bundle containing 2 or 3 little packets, which he laid upon the table. This first one come up, he said, selecting it from the rest, afore I'd been gone a week, a 50-pound banknote in a sheet of paper directed to me and put underneath the door in the night. She tried to hide her writing, but she couldn't hide it from me. So Somebody sent him £50? I'm not really following this. The first one came up, he said, selecting it from the rest, afore I had been gone a week. So it seems like maybe as Emily's traveling through Europe, she's sending her father money. I guess that's what's happening. He folded up the note again, with great patience and care, in exactly the same form, and laid it on one side. "This come to Mrs. Gummidge," he said, opening another, 2 or 3 months ago. After looking at it for some moments, he gave it to me, and added in a low voice, "Be so good, sir, as read it, sir." I read as follows. "Oh, what will you feel when you see this writing, and know it comes from my wicked hand? But try, not for my sake, but for Uncle's goodness, try to let your heart soften to me, only for a little time. Try, pray do, to relent towards a miserable girl, and write down on a bit of paper whether he is well, and what he said about me before you left off ever naming me among yourselves. And whether of a night, when it is my old time of coming home, you ever see him look as if he thought of one he used to love so dear. Oh, my heart is breaking when I think about it. I am kneeling down to you, begging you and praying you not be as hard with me as I deserve, as I well know I deserve. But to be so gentle and so good, and to write down something of him and send it to me. You need not call me little. You need not call me by the name I have disgraced. But oh, listen to my agony, and have mercy on me, so far as to write me some word of Uncle, never to be seen in this world by my eyes again. Dear, if your heart is hard towards me, justly hard, I know, but listen. If it is hard, dear, ask him I have wronged the most, him whose wife I was to have been, before you quite decide against my poor prayer, if he should be so compassionate as to say that you might write something for me to read. I think he would. Oh, I think he would. If you would only ask him, for he always was so brave and forgiving. Tell him then, but not else, that when I hear the wind blowing at night, I feel as if it was passing angrily from the seeing him and Uncle, and I was going up to God against me, and was going up to God against me. Tell him that if I was to die tomorrow, and oh, if I was fit, I would be so glad to die. I would bless him and Uncle with my last words and pray for his happy home with my last breath. Some money was enclosed in this letter also, £5. It was untouched, like the previous sum, and he refolded it in the same way. Detailed instructions were added relative to the address of a reply, which, although they betrayed the intervention of several hands, it made it difficult to arrive at any very probable conclusion in reference to her place of concealment. Okay, well, that's very complicated, but it's just saying they looked at the address where she was supposed to write, but it was very complicated to figure out exactly where she was. So there was really no way to find her just by looking at this address. What answer was sent? I inquired of Mr. Peggotty. Mrs. Gummidge, he returned, not being a good scholar, sir. Ham kindly drawed it out, and she made a copy on it. They told her I was gone to seek her, and what my parting words was. Is that another letter in your hand? Said I. It's money, sir, said Mr. Peggotty, unfolding it a little way. £10, you see. This doesn't sound like a lot of money, but it actually is. I mean, that's like £1,000 now. So, or maybe even 1,500 pounds now. So she's sending a lot of money to him. £10, you see, and wrote inside, from a true friend, like the first. But the first was put underneath the door. And this come by the post, day afore yesterday. I'm going to seek her at the postmark. So this letter was very recent, and now Mr. Peggotty is going to look for her from wherever the postmark is from. He showed it to me. It was a town on the Upper Rhine. He had found out at Yarmouth some foreign dealers who knew that country, and they had drawn him a rude map on paper, which he could very well understand. He laid it between us on the table, and with his chin resting upon one hand, tracked his course upon it with the other. I asked him how Ham was, and he shook his head. He works, he said, as bold as a man can. His name's as good in all that part as any man's is, anywhere in the world. Anyone's hand is ready to help him, you understand, and his is ready to help them. He's never been heard to complain, but my sister's belief is, twixt ourselves, as it has cut him deep. So he's saying Ham is fine. Emily was supposed to marry Ham, but then she ran away with Davy's friend. So now his heart is broken. He's a big, strong worker. And so when Davy says, well, how's Ham doing? Well, he's working, but he's still a good person. Poor fellow. I can believe it. He ain't no care, Master Davy, said Mr. Peggotty in a solemn whisper. Kinder no care nohow for his life. When a man's wanted for rough service and rough weather, he's there. When there's hard duty to be done with danger in it, he steps forward for all his mates. And yet he's as gentle as any child. There ain't a child in Yarmouth that don't know him. So Mr. Peggotty is saying he doesn't seem to care about his life. He volunteers to do very dangerous jobs. He's the first person to volunteer to do dangerous jobs. Well, he said, looking to his bag, having seen you tonight, Master Davy, and that does me good, I shall away betimes tomorrow morning. You've seen what I've got here, putting his hand on where the little packet lay. All that troubles me is to think that any harm might come to me afore that money was give back. If I was to die, and it was lost, or stole, or elseways made away with, and it was never knowed by him but what I'd took it, I believe that the other world wouldn't hold me. I believe I must come back. So Emily is sending him this money, but that's obviously coming from Steerforth. It's a lot of money. One time it was £50. That's like £7,500 now. £7,500 now. So that's a pretty good amount of money. And Mr. Barkis is saying, I have to return this. I don't want this money. I have to give this back to him. And he's saying, if I die before I return this money, I'll have to come back to this world and find a way to return it to him. He rose, and I rose too, and we grasped each other by the hand again before going out. I'd go 10,000 mile, he said. I'd go till I dropped dead to lay that money down afore him. If I do that, and I find my Emily, I'm content. So The two things he must accomplish in his life is return that money to Steerforth and find Emily. And if he can do that, he can die happily. If I don't find her, maybe she'll come to here sometime, as her loving uncle only ended his search for her when he ended his life, and I know her. Even that will turn her home at last. As he went out into the rigorous night, I saw the lonely figure flit away before us. I turned him hastily on some pretense, and held him in conversation until it was gone. So that's Martha. He saw Martha going away, and so Davy distracted Mr. Peggotty as Martha walked away because he didn't want him to see her. Maybe they weren't meeting. Maybe it was just a coincidence that they just happened to both be in the same area at the same time. I don't know. I turned him hastily on some pretense. A pretense is an excuse. And held him in conversation until it was gone. He spoke of a traveller's house on the Dover road, where he knew he could find a clean, plain lodging for the night. I went with him over Westminster Bridge, and parted from him on the Surrey shore. Everything seemed to my imagination to be hushed in reverence for him as he resumed his solitary journey through the snow. I returned to the inn yard, and, impressed by my remembrance of the face, looked awfully around for it. It was not there. The snow had covered our late footprints. My new track was the only one to be seen, and even that began to die away. It snowed so fast as I looked back over my shoulder. Okay, well, that was the end of chapter 40. That was kind of short, so I think I'm also going to read chapter 41 now. Why not? And I think I have the energy to do it since I'm drinking coffee. Let's see. So we've got chapter 41, Dora's Aunts. At last, an answer came from the two old ladies. They presented their compliments to Mr. Copperfield, and informed him that they had given his letter their best consideration with a view to the happiness of both parties, which I thought rather an alarming expression, not only because of the use that they had made of it in relation to the family difference before mentioned, but because I had, and have all my life, observed that conventional phrases are a sort of fireworks, easily let off and liable to take a great variety of shapes and colors, not at all suggested by their original form. The Mrs. Spenlow added that they had begged to forbear expressing, through the medium of correspondence, an opinion on the subject. So the aunts are saying, oh, we're happy to hear from you. We don't really want to give you an opinion just in writing. Of Mr. Copperfield communication, but that if Mr. Copperfield would do them the favor to call upon a certain day, accompanied, if he thought proper, by a confidential friend, they would be happy to hold some conversation on the subject. So Davy poured out his heart to the two aunts about this affair going on between him and Dora, who is now their responsibility. And the aunts are saying, well, we don't really want to, maybe they want to see him, they want to meet him and see what he's like before they give an opinion about whether it's a good idea to allow him to continue this relationship with Dora. So they said, why don't you come over one day for tea or for lunch with a friend, and we'll have a little meeting, a little conversation, and see how that goes. To this favor, Mr. Copperfield immediately replied with his respectful compliments that he would have the honor of waiting on the Misses Spenlow at the time appointed, accompanied in accordance with their kind permission by his friend Mr. Thomas Traddles of the Inner Temple. Having dispatched with missive, Mr. Copperfield fell into a condition of strong, nervous agitation, and so remained until the day arrived. It was a great augmentation to my uneasiness to be bereaved. At this eventful crisis of inestimable services of Miss Mills. But Mr. Mills, who was always doing something or other to annoy me, or I felt as if he were, which was the same thing, had brought his conduct to a climax by taking it into his head that he would go to India. Why should he go to India except to harass me? To be sure, he had nothing to do with any other part of the world, and had a good deal to do with that part, being entirely in the India trade, whatever that was. I had floating dreams myself concerning golden shawls and elephants' teeth, having been at Calcutta in his youth, and designing now to go out there again in the capacity of a resident partner. This was nothing to me. However, it was so much to him that for India he was bound, and Julia with him. So Dora's best friend, and the person who is kind of helping him and Dora get together, is gone. She's in India now. And Julia went into the country to take leave of her relations. Oh, she's not gone yet, but she went to the country to say goodbye to her relatives. And the house was put into a perfect suit of bills, announcing that it was to be let or sold, and that the furniture, mangle and all, was to be taken at a valuation. So here was another earthquake of which I became the sport, being before I had recovered from the shock of its predecessor. I was in several minds how to dress myself, or on that important day, being divided between my desire to appear advantage and my apprehension of putting on anything they might impair my severely practical character in the eyes of Mrs. Spenlow. Of the Mrs. Spenlow. I endeavored to hit a happy medium between these two extremes. My aunt approved of the result, and Mr. Dick threw one of his shoes after Traddles and me for luck as he went downstairs. Excellent fellow as I knew Traddles to be, and warmly attached to him as I was, I could not help wishing on that delicate occasion that he had never contracted the habit of brushing his hair so very upright. So Traddles is wearing his hair very, very high up, and it's annoying Davy. He loves Traddles, but he wished that he would, I guess, wear his hair in a more conservative way for this occasion. It gave him a surprised look. So his hair is standing up, and it makes him look surprised in a weird sort of way. It gave him a surprised look, not to say a hearth, broomy kind of expression, which my apprehensions whispered might be fatal to us. I took the liberty of mentioning it to Traddles as we were walking to Putney, and saying that if he would smooth it down a little. "My dear Copperfield," said Traddles, lifting off his hat and rubbing his hair all kinds of ways, "nothing would give me greater pleasure, but it won't." "Won't be smoothed down?" said I. "No," said Traddles, "nothing will induce it. If I was to carry 1/2 weight upon it, all the way to Putney, it would be up again in a moment. The weight was taken off. the moment the weight was taken off. So Traddles is saying, I want to, but it won't. Every time I try to put it down, it just goes back up again. You have no idea how obstinate my hair, you have no idea what obstinate hair mine is, Copperfield. I'm quite a fretful porcupine. So fretful means being worried or distressed. And then if you don't know what a porcupine is, let me show you a picture of a porcupine. Let's see if we can move this over. Can you see that? That's a porcupine. So fretful means like in a worried state, being very worried. And this is a porcupine. You see how his hair, I guess that's how Traddles' hair looks. I'm quite a fretful porcupine. I was a little disappointed, I must confess, but thoroughly charmed by his good nature, too. I told him how I esteemed his good nature, and said that his hair must have taken all the obstinacy out of his character, for he had none. Oh, obstinacy means stubborn. Oh, returned Traddles, laughing, I assure you it's quite an old story, my unfortunate hair. My uncle's wife couldn't bear it. She said it exasperated her. So that's kind of like it annoyed her. His hair used to annoy his aunt. It stood very much in my way, too, when I first fell in love with Sophie. Very much. Did she object to it? She didn't, rejoined Traddles, but her eldest sister, the one that's the beauty, quite made game of it, I understand. In fact, all the sisters laughed at it. Agreeable, said I. Yes, returned Traddles with perfect innocence. It's a joke for us. They pretend that Sophie has a lock of it in her desk, and it is obliged to shut it in a clasped book to keep it weighed down. Remember, a lock of hair is like a collection of hair. So this would be a lock. If you cut this off, this would be a lock of hair. So they're joking that she keeps a lock of his hair in a book, which is something that maybe ladies or men did when they were in love with someone 200 years ago. But the funny part is it had to be a book that you could attach, because if it wasn't, the book would just open up again. We laugh about it. By the by, my dear Traddles, said I, your experience may suggest something to me. When you became engaged to the young lady whom you have just mentioned, did you make a regular proposal to her family? Was there anything like what we are going through today, for instance? I added nervously. Why, replied Traddles, on whose attentive face a thoughtful shade had stolen. It was a rather painful transaction, Copperfield, in my case. You see, Sophie being of so much use in the family, none of them could endure the thought of her ever being married. Indeed, they had quite settled among themselves that she never was to be married, and they called her the old maid, accordingly, when I mentioned it, and the greatest precaution to Mrs. Crewler. The mamma? I said. The mamma, says Traddles. Reverend Horace Crewler. When I mentioned it with every possible precaution to Mrs. Crewler, the effect upon her was such that she gave a scream and became insensible. I couldn't approach the subject again for months. You did at last, said I. Well, "The Reverend Horace did," said Traddles. "He is an excellent man, most exemplary in every way, and he pointed out to her that she ought to, as a Christian, to reconcile herself to the sacrifice, especially as it was so certain, and to bear no uncharitable feeling towards me. As to myself, Copperfield, I give you my word, I felt a perfect bird of prey towards the family." "The sisters took your part, I hope, Traddles?" "Why, I can't say that they did," he returned. "When we had comparatively reconciled Mrs. Crewler to it, we had to break it to Sarah. You recollect my mentioning Sarah as the one that has something the matter with her spine?" "Perfectly." "She clenched both of her hands," said Traddles. This is clenching your hands. "Looking at me in dismay. Shut her eyes, turned lead color, became perfectly stiff, and took nothing for 2 days but toast and water, administered with a teaspoon." "What a very unpleasant girl, Traddles," I remarked. "Oh, I beg your pardon, Copperfield," said Traddles. "She's a very charming girl, but she has a great deal of feeling. In fact, they all have. Sophie told me afterwards that the self-reproach she underwent while she was in attendance upon Sarah, no words could describe. I know it must have been severe, but my own feelings, Copperfield, which were like a criminal's after Sarah was restored, we still had to break it to the other 8. And it produced various effects upon them, of a most pathetic nature. The 2 little ones whom Sophie educates have only just left off detesting me, hating me. At any rate, they're all reconciled to it now, I hope, said I. "Yes, I should say they were, on the whole, resigned to it," said Traddles doubtfully. "The fact is, we avoid mentioning the subject, and my unsettled prospects and indifferent circumstances are a great consolation to them. There will be a deplorable scene whenever we are married. It will be much more like a funeral than a wedding, and they'll all hate me for taking her away." Wow, that's horrible. So the girl that Traddles is marrying has, I think, like 8 sisters, and one of them is very sick, and they depend on the girl that he's going to marry to take care of the sick one. So they all decided, including the mother, that she was never going to get married. She would just stay in the family and take care of everyone. So they hated when Traddles proposed marriage to her. They've gotten used to the idea, but they're kind of in denial. And when the wedding finally happens, it's not going to be nice, because that will be like a shock to them when it finally really happens. And Davy thought he had troubles with his fiancée. His honest face, as he looked at me, with a serio-comic shake of his head, impresses me more in the remembrance than it did in the reality, for I was by this time in a state of such excessive trepidation and wandering of mind as to be quite unable to fix my attention on anything. On our approaching the house where the Mrs. Spenlow lived, I was at such a discount in respect of my personal looks and presence of mind that Traddles proposed a gentle stimulant in the form of a glass of ale. This having been administered at a neighboring public house, he conducted me with tottering steps to Mrs. Spenlow's door. So Davy was so nervous by the time they got near the Spenlow's house that his friend proposed, "Oh, let's have a drink first before we start this." I had a vague sensation of being, as it were, on view when the maid opened it, and of wavering somehow across the hall with a weather glass in it, into a quiet little drawing room on the ground floor, commanding a neat garden, also sitting down here on a sofa and seeing Traddles here start up, Now his hat was removed, like one of those obtrusive little figures made of springs that fly out of fictitious snuff boxes when the lid is taken off. Also, so, I guess the modern version of that would be the can, and you open the can and the snake pops out, the snake. So when Traddles took off his hat, that's what his hair did. Also, hearing of an old-fashioned clock ticking away on the chimney piece and trying to make it keep time to the jerking of my heart, which it wouldn't. Also, of looking round the room for any sign of Dora and seeing none. Also of thinking that Jip once barked in the distance and was instantly choked by somebody. Ultimately, I found myself backing Traddles into the fireplace and bowing in great confusion to two dry little elderly ladies dressed in black, and each looking wonderfully like a preparation in chip or tan of the late Mr. Spenlow. So they look very much like their brother. "Pray," said one of the two little ladies, "be seated." When I had done tumbling over Traddles, and had sat upon something which was not a cat, my first seat was, I so far recovered my sight as to perceive that Mr. Spenlow had evidently been the youngest of the family, when there was a disparity of 6 or 8 years between the two sisters, and that the younger appeared to be the manager of the conference, inasmuch as she had my letter in her hand, so familiar as it looked to me, and yet so odd, and was referring to it through the eyeglass. They were dressed alike, but this sister wore her dress with more youthful air than the other, and perhaps had a trifle more frill, or tucker, or brooch, or bracelet, or some little thing of that kind, which made her look more lively. They were both upright in their carriage, formal and precise, composed and quiet. The sister, who had not my letter, had her arms crossed at her breast, and resting on each other like an idol. "Mr. Copperfield, I believe," said the sister who had got my letter, addressing herself to Traddles. This was a frightful beginning. So the sister says, "Mr. Copperfield," but she's talking to Traddles. And so she says, Davy says, "This is a frightful beginning." Traddles had to indicate that I was Mr. Copperfield. So Traddles said, him. And I had to lay claim to myself, and they had to divest themselves of a preconceived opinion that Traddles was Mr. Copperfield, and altogether we were in a nice condition. To improve it, we all distinctly heard Jip give 2 short barks and receive another choke. "Mr. Copperfield," said the sister with the letter, "I did something, bowed, I suppose, and was all attention when the other sister struck in. My sister Lavinia," said she, "being conversant with matters of this nature, will state what we consider most calculated to promote the happiness of both parties." I discovered afterwards that Miss Lavinia was an authority in affairs of the heart, by reason of there having anciently existed a certain Mr. Pidger, who played a short whist, and was supposed to have been enamored of her. My private opinion is that this was entirely a gratuitous assumption, and that Pidger was altogether innocent of any such sentiments, to which he had never given any sort of expression that I could ever hear of. Both Miss Lavinia and Miss Clarissa had a superstition, however, that he would have declared his passion if he had not been cut short in his youth, at about 60, by over-drinking his constitution and overdoing an attempt to set it right again by swilling bath water. So one of these aunts are old maids. Old maids are old women who have never been married. And one of them is considered to be an expert in love because once she loved an old man who didn't love her back. And but the aunts tell themselves the only reason that he never proposed marriage to them or to her was because he died from drinking alcohol. And this was when he was 60. But this is what makes her an expert in love, that she had this affair. Oh, that's so sad. They had a lurking suspicion even that he died of secret love, though I must say there was a picture of him in the house with a damask nose, which concealment did not appear to have ever preyed upon. "We will not," said Miss Lavinia, "enter on the past history of this matter. Our poor brother Francis's death has cancelled that." "We had not," said Miss Clarissa, "been in the habit of frequent association with our brother Francis, but there was no decided division or disunion between us. Francis took his road, we took ours. We considered it conducive to the happiness of all parties that it should be so, and it was so." Each of the sisters leaned a little forward to speak, shook her head after speaking, and became upright again when silent. Miss Clarissa never moved her arms. She sometimes played tunes upon them with her fingers, minuets, marches, a little, I should think, but never moved them. So she's moving her fingers, but I'm not really sure. Wait, Miss Clarissa never moved her arms. She sometimes played tunes upon them with her fingers. Oh, so maybe doing something like this. But she never moved her arms. "Our niece's position, or supposed position, is much changed by our brother Francis's death," said Miss Lavinia, "and therefore we consider our brother's opinions as regarded her position as being changed too. We have no reason to doubt, Mr. Copperfield, that you are a young gentleman possessed of good qualities and honorable character, or that you have an affection, or are fully persuaded that you have an affection for our niece." I replied, as I usually did when I had a chance, that nobody had ever loved anybody else as I loved Dora. Traddles came to my assistance with confirmatory murmur. Miss Lavinia was going on to make some rejoinder, when Miss Clarissa, who appeared to be incessantly beset by a desire to refer to her brother Francis, struck in again. "If Dora's mamma," she said, "when she married our brother Francis, had at once said that there was not room for the family at the dinner table, it would have been better for the happiness of all parties." "Sister Clarissa," said Miss Lavinia, "perhaps we needn't mind that now." So we discovered in an earlier chapter the reason that the sisters stopped talking to Dora's mother was because when Dora was born and had her baptism, they invited the sisters to, I don't even remember what it was now, like to tea or something like that. And they were extremely insulted by that because they felt that it was such an important occasion. They should have been invited to dinner, but they weren't. They were just invited to tea. So they felt very insulted by that. And they never saw their brother again, or Dora. "Sister Lavinia," said Clarissa, "it belongs to the subject. With your branch of the subject on which alone you are competent to speak, I should not think of interfering. On this branch of the subject, I have a voice and an opinion, and it would have been better for the happiness of all parties if Dora's mamma, when she married our brother Francis, had mentioned plainly what her intentions were. We should then have known what we had to expect. We should have said, "Pray, do not invite us any time." And all possibility of misunderstanding would have been avoided. When Miss Clarissa had shaken her head, Miss Lavinia resumed again, referring to my letter through her eyeglass. They both had little bright round twinkling eyes, by the way, which were like birds' eyes. They were not unlike birds, altogether, having a sharp, brisk, sudden manner, and a little short, spruce way of adjusting themselves like canaries. Miss Lavinia, as I've said, resumed, "You asked permission of my sister Clarissa and myself, Mr. Copperfield, to visit here, as the accepted suitor of our niece." "If our brother Francis," said Miss Clarissa, breaking out again, if I may call anything so calm a breaking out, "wished to surround himself with an atmosphere of Doctors' Commons, and Doctors' Commons only, what right or desire had we to object? None, I'm sure. We have ever been far from wishing to obtrude ourselves on anyone. But why not say so? Let our brother Francis and his wife have their society. Let my sister Lavinia and myself have our society. We can find it for ourselves, I hope." As this appeared to be addressed to Traddles and me, both Traddles and I made some sort of reply. Traddles was inaudible. I think I observed myself that it was highly creditable to all concerned. I don't in the least know what I meant. There's still going on about this thing that happened 20 years ago when they didn't invite them to a dinner for the baptism of Dora. And Traddles and Davy, they don't know what to say, so they're like, yeah, you're right, of course. You go your way, he goes his way, sure. Where's Dora? "Sister Lavinia," said Miss Clarissa, having now relieved her mind. "You can go on, my dear." Miss Lavinia proceeded. "Mr. Copperfield, my sister Clarissa and I have been very careful indeed in considering this letter, and we have not considered it without finally showing it to our niece, and discussing it with our niece, and we have no doubt that you think you like her very much." "Think, ma'am," I rapturously began. "Oh!" But Miss Clarissa, giving me a look, like a sharp canary, as requesting that I would not interrupt the oracle, I begged pardon. "Affection," said Miss Lavinia, glancing at her sister for corroboration, which she gave in the form of a little nod to every clause. "Mature affection, homage, devotion, does not easily express itself. Its voice is low. It is modest, retiring. It lies in ambush, waits and waits. Such is the mature fruit. Sometimes life glides away and finds it still ripening in the shade." Of course, I did not understand now that this was an allusion to her supposed experience of the stricken Pidger. But I saw from the gravity with which Miss Clarissa nodded her head that great weight was attached to these words. So they only know love through this experience of this weird infatuation, which maybe lasted years, of one of the sisters to some old drunk guy. And so when Davy says, "Oh, I'm madly in love with Dora," the aunts say, no, that's not love. Love takes a very long and slow time to grow. So that's their attitude, because that's their experience in the matter. The light, for I call them, in comparison to such sentiments, the light inclinations of very young people, pursued Miss Lavinia, are dust compared to rocks. It is owing to that difficulty of knowing whether they are likely to endure, or have any real foundation, that my sister Clarissa and myself have been very undecided how to act, Mr. Copperfield and Mr. Traddles, said my friend, finding himself looked at. I beg pardon, of the Inner Temple, I believe, said Miss Clarissa, again glancing at my letter. Traddles said, exactly so, and became pretty red in the face. Now, although I have not received any express encouragement as yet, I fancied that I saw in the two little sisters, particularly in Miss Lavinia, an intensified enjoyment of this new and fruitful subject of domestic interest. A settling down to make the most of it, a disposition to pet it, in which there was a good bright ray of hope. I thought I perceived that Miss Lavinia would have uncommon satisfaction in superintending two young lovers like Dora and me, and that Miss Clarissa would have hardly less satisfaction in seeing her superintend us, and in chiming in with her own particular department of subject whenever that impulse was strong upon her. So Davy's starting to realize, they do want us to get together, but they want to play a part in all of this. They're kind of looking forward to guiding us together and supervising us before we get married. So he's starting to realize, I think they like this idea. This gave me courage to protest most vehemently that I loved Dora. Oh wait, I think I skipped something. No, this gave me courage to protest vehemently that I loved Dora, better than I could tell or anyone believe, and that all of my friends knew how I loved her, that my aunt, Agnes, Traddles, everyone who knew me, knew how I loved her, and how earnest my love had made me. For the truth of this, I appealed to Traddles, and Traddles, firing up as if he were plunging into the parliamentary debate, really did come out nobly, confirming me in good round terms, and in plain, sensible, practical manner, that evidently made a favorable impression. I speak, if I may presume to say so, as one who has some little experience of such things, said Traddles, being myself engaged to a young lady, one of 10, down in Devonshire, and seeing no probability at present of our engagement coming to a termination. You may be able to confirm what I have said, Mr. Traddles, observed Miss Lavinia, evidently taking a new interest in him, of the affection that is modest and retiring, that waits and waits. Entirely, ma'am, said Traddles. Miss Clarissa looked at Miss Lavinia and shook her head gravely. Miss Lavinia looked consciously at Miss Clarissa and heaved a little sigh. Sister Lavinia, said Miss Clarissa, take my smelling bottle. Miss Lavinia revived herself with a few whiffs. Whiffs is like smelling. That's a whiff. Of aromatic vinegar. Traddles and I looking on with great solicitude the while, and then went on to say rather faintly, my sister and myself have been in great doubt, Mr. Traddles, what course we ought to take in reference to the likings or imaginary likings of such very young people as your friend Mr. Copperfield and our niece. Our brother Francis's child, remarked Miss Clarissa. If our brother Francis's wife had found it convenient in her lifetime, though she had an unquestionable right to act as she thought best, to invite the family to her dinner table, we might have known our brother Francis's child better at the present moment. Sister Lavinia, proceed. Miss Lavinia turned my letter so as to bring the superscription towards herself, and referred through her eyeglass to some orderly-looking notes she had made on the part of it. It seems to us, she said, prudent, Mr. Traddles, to bring these feelings to the test of our observation. So they're saying we want to see these two together, Davy and Dora, so we can see if they really are in love. At present, we know nothing of them and are not in a situation to judge how much reality there may be in them. Therefore, we are inclined so far to accede to Mr. Copperfield's proposal as to admit his visits here. So they're saying he can come and visit Dora, or he can come and visit, I think he can come and visit us, and maybe we'll let him see Dora. I shall never, dear ladies, I exclaimed, relieved of an immense load of apprehension, forget your kindness. But, pursued Miss Lavinia, but we would prefer to regard those visits, Mr. Traddles, as made at present to us. We must guard ourselves from recognizing any positive engagement between Mr. Copperfield and our niece until we've had an opportunity. Until you have had an opportunity, Sister Lavinia, said Miss Clarissa. Be it so, assented Miss Lavinia with a sigh, until I have had an opportunity of observing them. Copperfield, said Traddles, turning to me, you feel, I am sure, that nothing could be more reasonable or considerate. Nothing, I cried. I'm deeply sensible of it. In this position of affairs, said Miss Lavinia, again referring to her notes and admitting his visits on this understanding only, we must require from Mr. Copperfield a distinct assurance, on his word of honor, that no communication of any kind shall take place between him and our niece without our knowledge, that no project whatever shall be entertained with regard to our niece without being first submitted to us. To you, Sister Lavinia, Miss Clarissa interposed. Be it so, Clarissa assented Miss Lavinia resignedly. To me, and receiving our concurrence, we must make this a most expressive and serious stipulation, not to be broken on any account. We wished Mr. Copperfield to be accompanied by some confidential friend today, with an inclination of her head towards Traddles, who bowed, in order that there might be no doubt or misconception on this subject. So they asked Davy to bring a friend so that there could be no confusion. They have a witness. Okay, maybe we'll let you see Dora, but everything that you do, you have to go through us first. And they asked him to bring a friend to witness this, and so that later there would be no confusion about writing secret letters or something like that, making secret promises or arrangements. In order that there might be no doubt or misconception on this subject, if Mr. Copperfield, or if you, Mr. Traddles, feel the least scruple in giving this promise, I beg you to take time to consider it. So before you promise, make sure you really think about it, because we are going to hold you to this promise. I exclaimed, in a state of high ecstatic fervor, that not a moment's consideration could be necessary. I bound myself by the required promise, in a most impassioned manner, called upon Traddles to witness it, and denounced myself as the most atrocious of characters if I ever swerved from it in the least degree. So Davy's being very dramatic, saying, oh yes, I promise, I absolutely promise, and if I break my promise, I will be the worst person who ever lived. Uh-oh, I've become blurry. I've got to fix my camera. Just 1 second while I fix my technical difficulties. Okay. "Stay," said Miss Lavinia, holding up her hand. "We resolved, before we had the pleasure of receiving you two gentlemen, to leave you alone for a quarter of an hour to consider this point. You will allow us to retire." It was in vain for me to say that no consideration was necessary. They persisted in withdrawing for the specified time. Accordingly, these little birds hopped out with great dignity, leaving me to receive the congratulations of Traddles, and to feel as if I were translated to regions of exquisite happiness. Exactly at the expiration of a quarter of an hour, they reappeared with no less dignity than they had disappeared. They had gone rustling away, as if their little dresses were made of autumn leaves, and they came rustling back in like manner. And then I bound myself once more to the prescribed conditions. "Sister Clarissa," said Miss Lavinia, "the rest is with you." Miss Clarissa, unfolding her arms for the first time, took the notes and glanced at them. "We shall be happy," said Miss Clarissa, "to see Mr. Copperfield to dinner every Sunday, if it should suit his convenience. Our hour is 3. I bowed. "In the course of the week," said Miss Clarissa, "we shall be happy to see Mr. Copperfield to tea. Our hour is 6:30. I bowed again. "Twice in the week," said Miss Clarissa, "but as a rule, not oftener." I bowed again. "Miss Trotwood," said Miss Clarissa, "mentioned in Copperfield's letter, will perhaps call upon us, when visiting is better for the happiness of all parties. We are glad to receive visits and return them, when it is better for the happiness of all parties that no visiting should take place, as in the case of our brother Francis and his establishment that is quite different." I intimated that my aunt would be proud and delighted to make their acquaintance, though I must say I was not quite sure of their getting on very satisfactorily with her. The conditions being now closed, I expressed my acknowledgments in the warmest manner, and taking the hand of first Miss Clarissa and then Miss Lavinia, pressed it, in each case, against my lips. Miss Lavinia then arose, and begging Mr. Traddles to excuse us for a minute, requested me to follow her. I obeyed, all in a tremble, and was conducted into another room, and there I found my blessed darling stopping her ears behind the door, so Dora was listening, and Jip in the plate warmer with his head tied up in a towel. Oh, how beautiful she was in her black frock, and how she sobbed and cried at first and wouldn't come out from behind the door. How fond we were of one another when she did come out at last, and what a state of bliss I was in when we took Jip out of the plate warmer and restored him to the light, sneezing very much, and we were all three reunited. My dearest Dora, now indeed my own forever. "Oh, don't," pleaded Dora, "please." "Are you not my own forever, Dora?" "Oh, yes, of course I am," cried Dora, "but I'm so frightened." "Frightened, my own?" "Oh, yes, I don't like him," said Dora. "Why don't he go?" "Who, my life?" "Your friend," said Dora. "It isn't any business of his. What a stupid he must be." "My love." There never was anything so coaxing as her childish ways. "He's the best creature." "Oh, but we don't want any best creatures," pouted Dora. "My dear," I argued, "you will soon know him well, and like him of all things, and here is my aunt coming soon, and you'll like her of all things too when you know her." "No, please don't bring her," said Dora, giving me a horrified little kiss and holding her hands. "Don't! I know she's a naughty, mischief-making old thing. Don't let her come here, Dodie." Which was a corruption of David, so that's what she called him, Dodie. Remonstrance was of no use then, so I laughed and admired and was very much in love and very happy, and she showed me Jip's new trick of standing on his hind legs in the corner, which he did for about the space of a flash of lightning, and then fell down. And I don't know how long I should have stayed there, oblivious to Traddles, if Miss Lavinia had not come in to take me away. Miss Lavinia was very fond of Dora. She told me Dora was exactly like what she had been herself at her age. She must have altered a great deal. And she treated Dora just as if she had been a toy. I wanted to persuade Dora to come and see Traddles, but on my proposing it, she ran off to her own room and locked herself in. So I went to Traddles without her, and walked away with him on air. "Nothing could be more satisfactory," said Traddles. "And they're very agreeable old ladies, I'm sure. I shouldn't be at all surprised if you were to be married years before me, Copperfield. Does your Sophie play on any instrument, Traddles?" I inquired in the pride of my heart. "She knows enough of the piano to teach it to her little sisters," said Traddles. "Does she sing at all?" I asked. "Why, she sings ballads, sometimes to freshen up the others a little when they're out of spirits," said Traddles. "Nothing scientific." "She doesn't sing to the guitar?" said I. "Oh dear, no," said Traddles. "Paint at all?" "Not at all," said Traddles. I promised Traddles that he should hear Dora sing and see some of her flower painting. He said he should like it very much, and we went home, arm in arm, in a good humor and delight. I encouraged him to talk about Sophie on the way, which he did with a loving reliance on her that I very much admired. I compared her in my mind with Dora, with considerable inward satisfaction, but I candidly admitted to myself, candidly means like secretly, but I candidly admitted to myself that she seemed to be an excellent kind of girl for Traddles, too. Of course, my aunt was immediately made acquainted with the successful issue of the conference and with all that had been said and done in the course of it, and she was happy to see me so happy, and promised to call on Dora's aunts without loss of time. But she took such a long walk up and down our room that night, while I was writing to Agnes, and that I began to think she meant to walk till morning. My letter to Agnes was a fervent and grateful one, narrating all the good effects that had resulted from my following her advice. She wrote by return of post to me. Her letter was hopeful, earnest, and cheerful. She was always cheerful from that time. I had my hands more full than ever now, my daily journeys to Highgate considered. Putney was a long way off, and I naturally wanted to go there as often as I could, the proposed tea drinkings being quite impracticable. I compounded with Miss Lavinia for permission to visit every Saturday afternoon without detriment to my privileged Sundays. So the close of every week was a delicious time for me, and I go through the rest of the week by looking forward to it. I was wonderfully relieved to find that my aunt and Dora's aunts rubbed on, so they got along. All things considered, much more smoothly than I could have expected. My aunt made her promised visit within a few days of the conference, and within a few more days Dora's aunts called upon her in due state and form. Similar but more friendly exchanges took place afterwards, usually at intervals of 3 or 4 weeks. I know that my aunt distressed Dora's aunts very much by utterly setting at naught the dignity of fly conveyance and walking out to Putney at extraordinary times, as shortly after breakfast or just before tea, likewise by wearing her bonnet in any manner that happened to be comfortable to her head, without at all deferring to the prejudices of civilization on the subject. But Dora's aunts soon agreed to regard my aunt as an eccentric and somewhat masculine lady. with a strong understanding, and although my aunt occasionally ruffled the feathers of Dora's aunts, if you ruffle someone's feathers, if a bird becomes angry or nervous, their feathers kind of push out. And those are ruffled feathers. So if you ruffle someone's feathers, you make them annoyed or angry. So Davy says, what did he say? Although my aunt occasionally ruffled the feathers of Dora's aunts. So sometimes Davy's aunt would make them annoyed or angry by expressing heretical opinions on various points of ceremony. She loved me too well not to sacrifice some of her peculiarities to the general harmony. So his aunt tried. She didn't always succeed, but she tried to be very friendly towards Dora's aunts so as not to ruin this engagement. The only member of our small society who positively refused to adapt himself to circumstances was Jip. He never saw my aunt without immediately displaying every tooth in his head, retiring under the chair, and growling incessantly, with now and then a doleful howl, as she really were too much for his feelings. All kinds of treatment were tried with him, coaxing, scolding, slapping, bringing him to Buckingham Street, where he instantly dashed at the two cats, to the terror of all beholders. But he never could prevail upon himself to bear my aunt's society. He would sometimes think he had got the better of his objection, and be amiable for a few minutes, and then would put up his snub nose and howl to that extent. But there was nothing for it but to blind him and put him in the plate warmer. At length, Dora regularly muffled him in a towel. Muffling is when you cover someone's mouth so that they can't make noise. That's muffling. So sometimes Dora would put a towel near his mouth to prevent him from so it wouldn't be so annoying. At length, Dora regularly muffled him in a towel and shut him up there whenever my aunt was reported at the door. One thing troubled me much after we had fallen into this quiet train. It was that Dora seemed by one consent to be regarded like a pretty toy or plaything. My aunt, with whom she gradually became familiar, always called her Little Blossom. And the pleasure of Miss Lavinia's life was to wait upon her, curl her hair, make ornaments for her, and treat her like a little pet child. What Miss Lavinia did, her sister did, as a matter of course. It was very odd to me, but they all seemed to treat Dora in her degree, much as Dora treated Jip in his. I made up my mind to speak to Dora about this, and one day, as we were out walking, for we were licensed by Miss Lavinia after a while to go out walking by ourselves, I said to her that I wished she could get them to behave towards her differently. Because my darling, I remonstrated, you're not a child. There, said Dora, now you're going to be cross. Cross, my love. I'm sure they're very kind to me, said Dora, and I'm very happy. Well, but my dearest life, said I, you might be very happy, but yet be treated rationally. Dora gave me a reproachful look, the prettiest look, and then began to sob, saying, if I didn't like her, why had I ever wanted so much to be engaged to her, and why didn't I go away, now if I couldn't bear her? What could I do but kiss away her tears and tell her how I doted on her after that? I'm sure I'm very affectionate, said Dora. You oughtn't to be cruel to me, Dodie. Cruel, my precious love, as if I would or could be cruel to you for the world. Then don't find fault with me, said Dora, making a rosebud of her mouth, and I'll be good. I was charmed by her presently asking me of her own accord to give her that cookery book, that I once had spoken of, and to show her how to keep accounts, as I had once promised I would. I brought the volume with me on my next visit. I got it prettily bound first, to make it look less dry and more inviting, and as we strolled about the common, I showed her an old housekeeping book of my aunt's, and gave her a set of tablets, and a pretty little pencil case and a box of leads to practice housekeeping with. But the cookery book made Dora's head ache, and the figures made her cry. They wouldn't add up, she said. So she rubbed them out and drew little nosegays and likenesses of me and Jip all over the tablets. Then I playfully tried verbal instruction in domestic matters as we walked about on Saturday afternoon. Sometimes, for example, we passed a butcher's shop, and I would say, "Now suppose, my pet, that we were married, and you were going away to buy a shoulder of mutton for dinner. Would you know how to buy it?" My pretty little Dora's face would fall, and she would make her mouth into a bud again, and as she would very much prefer to shut mine out with a kiss. "Would you know how to buy it, my darling?" I would repeat, perhaps, if I were very inflexible. Dora would think a little, and then reply, perhaps with great triumph, "Why, the butcher would know how to sell it, and what need I know?" "Oh, you silly boy." So when I once asked Dora, with an eye on the cookery book, with an eye to the cookery book, what she would do if we were married, and I were to say I should like a nice Irish stew, she replied that she would tell the servant to make it, and then clapped her little hands together across my arm, and laughed in such a charming manner that she was more delightful than ever. Consequently, the principal use to which the cookery book was devoted was being put down in the corner for Jip to stand upon. But Dora was so pleased when she had trained him to stand upon it without offering to come off, and at the same time to hold the pencil case in his mouth, and I was very glad that I had bought it. And we fell back on the guitar case and the flower painting and the songs about never leaving off dancing, ta-ra-la, and were as happy as the week was long. I occasionally wished I could venture to hint to Miss Lavinia that she treated the darling of my heart a little too much like a plaything, and I sometimes awoke, as it were, wondering to find that I had fallen into the general fault and treated her like a plaything too, but not often. All right, well, so that was the end of chapter 41. So next time, probably tomorrow night, we will be looking at chapter 42, Mischief. All right, well, thank you, everyone who stayed and watched, and I hope you come back tomorrow to read chapter 42 with me, Mischief. So I'll see you tomorrow. Goodbye.